just recognizing the shifting distribution of power. That is, if you have the US as a declining hegemon and China rising, it doesn't mean, you switch from one alliance to another one, but just, again, the ticket is diversification, then you avoid these alliances. So I would recommend, by all means, forge as close possible partnership and relationship with the United States. Just make sure doesn't become zero sum. That is, that the relationship with the US becomes a front against China. So, as you know, your former Prime Minister Paul Keating said, you need Asia needs NATO like it needs the plague. This is not what you want. It's not a success story.
Glenn Diesen is one of the world's leading commentators on the Russia-Ukraine war. He's a Norwegian political scientist. You've seen him on so many YouTube channels. And he has his own YouTube channel where he does some fantastic interviews with some really stellar guests. He joined me for a wide-ranging discussion about his book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, and what it suggests to us about what's going on in Ukraine today as the strains of war impact on that society, the progress of the United States and Russia peace talks around the war in Ukraine, the role of Europe in those peace talks, the development of a new Eurasian world order, and finally, what all those changes mean. The development of a multipolar world means the opportunities of a multipolar world, what they create for a middle power like Australia. I hope you enjoy the interview. Thank you, Glenn Diesen, for joining me today. It's really wonderful to have you here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And thanks so much for your work. I know a lot of my viewers will have seen you and known that, over time you've received, a lot of plaudits, but also the occasional brickbat for your commentary on issues to do with Ukraine. But I'm sure all my viewers are deeply, deeply appreciative of your work. So thanks very much for all of that.
Oh, my pleasure.
So your commentary on the events in Ukraine is pretty well known to viewers. So I thought I'd want to focus maybe on the bigger picture issues that you sort of discuss in your book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, and specifically how the Ukraine War is influencing world order, and I guess adding into that how the strategic positioning of the US government today under Trump 2.0 is sort of influencing world order, but also sort of, I guess, what opportunities that creates for places, including middle powers like little old Australia, where I'm coming from. So rather than talk about the sort of day-to-day events, things change. It's the 15th of April. At the moment, the penguins and Heard Island are free of tariffs, but that might change during the course of the interview. But I thought I might begin with Ukraine itself. And you've done a couple of quite compelling recent interviews with the journalist Diane Panchenko and an opposition leader, which was actually recorded from jail in Ukraine. And I just wonder what those interviews told you about the state of Ukrainian society today, several years into this war, and what the prospects are for recovery and reconciliation within Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, those were two different interviews. The first one was Alexander Dubinsky. He's an MEP in the Ukrainian parliament, and he was also part of Zelensky's own political party, that is. But now he's in prison. He says he's running for presidency, but he's also calling for the impeachment of Zelensky. So if he's running for president, he will be from jail. And Diana Panchenko, she's a journalist. Again, she was awarded the title of Journalist of the Year back in 2020. But I thought these were interesting people to speak with, because the danger when we're at war, that is human beings, there's a tendency to always simplify. That is, one always almost have to go into the sociology of human nature, because everything is about us versus them. We go into the in-group, so we say, oh, well, do you support Ukraine? Well, then you have to, send weapons to this, and one side has to be, pushed, held up like the new Churchill, which is Zelensky, and the other side, Putin, will be Hitler, and we go into the cliches, and as almost to demonstrate our loyalty to the correct group, as it was, and anyone who doesn't fall in line is often criticized. But again, my main point behind the whole thing, behind the analysis, is not only by saying, we stand by Ukraine, send more weapons. This is not necessarily good for Ukraine. It's not necessarily good for us. So I guess what I found interesting to speak with them is the idea that Zelensky is not Ukraine. There is an opposition there, and there's a very big opposition, and I thought it was worth getting their perspective, because keep in mind that it used to be something everyone agreed on, that the Ukraine was a very and deeply corrupt society, but the politicians, the oligarchy, there was huge problems around this, and we also recognized the undisputable facts which can't be denied, such as the political opposition parties having been purged. Many opposition leaders have been thrown in jail. Some have had their citizenship taken away from them. We see religious freedoms being revoked, media freedom, or the old opposition media has been removed, or been less the control of Zelensky. And I think that these are important information, because whenever we say we stand with Ukraine, what exactly does that mean? Because I feel often we interpret it as, well, we can't criticize Zelensky in any way because he represents Ukraine. If you criticize him, then you're trying to weaken Ukraine and undermine their position. In other words, you're carrying water for Putin. That's what we're saying. But when we say we stand with Ukraine, why don't we care about this? The Ukrainians who have suffered under a lot of this oppression. And my argument is, if we had recognized this from 2014, we could have avoided this war. But our first impulse is always to make excuses for it, because we want to show our support for Ukraine. And this could come from a good place. But by doing so, we contributed to sowing divisions within Ukraine, and also bringing forward a war. And again, this is not really new ideas either, which is why I think it's important to remember people like CIA Director William Burns, because he wrote this back in 2008. He warned, if we try to get Ukraine into the NATO orbit, because of the internal divisions within Ukraine, it would likely trigger a civil war. And it's very likely that the Russians would, reluctantly, he argued, but nonetheless intervene militarily, because they would then see it as necessary to intervene on behalf of the Eastern Ukrainians. So we have all this idea that every time we say we stand with Ukraine, it's not always the Ukrainians are on board. That is, from 91 to 2014, we said we're going to help Ukraine to get into NATO, even though then only 20% wanted it. We said we're going to help Ukraine, stand by them in the Maidan, when they toppled Yanukovych, but a majority of Ukrainians did not support this. And we saw that we're going to help Ukraine not to capitulate to Russia, when 73% of them in 2019 actually voted for the Minsk peace agreement to have it implemented. We still want negotiation. But the Europeans say, no, we're going to stand with Ukraine. We're just going to send weapons and continue to effectively refuse diplomacy and negotiations with the Russians. I think a lot of terrible things have been done under this mantra of standing with Ukraine. And this is kind of my idea, what is important to actually speak to the opposition.
I recently did an interview, which is coming out, I think, tomorrow, with the Ukrainian historian Marta Havrishko. I don't know if you know her, but she's, a student of the Holocaust. And she really emphasizes the extent to which extreme far-right ethno-nationalism, to use a somewhat euphemistic term, has really taken hold in Ukraine. And certainly her view is there needs to be a path out from that sort of the hold that has had on society. I don't know. Did Diane Panchenko talk about that sort of issue as well in the interview?
Diana Panchenko spoke about this, but not only her though. The former advisor of Zelensky, his main advisor, that is Alexei Arestovich, he also speaks about this, and he's quite vocal now. But he's also, of course, gone into exile because he fell out of favor with Zelensky. But his argument was the same, and he doesn't. Again, that's why it's so dangerous to fall into this trap of pro-Ukrainian versus pro-Russian. His argument was very simple, that the Bandera identity in Ukraine, which is a small minority, that is the one who is more sympathetic to fascism and as a path towards national independence away from Russia, that they kind of been able to hijack to represent the Ukrainian identity as it was. And he said that this was very dangerous for Ukraine because not that different from what William Burns said is what they did, the Ukrainians, was first they deeply divided society, because now they're asking millions of Ukrainians who are ethnic Russians or Russian speakers that they should come and fight and die for Ukraine, which considers them to be second-rate citizens, to be some descendant of the Yellow Horde or the Mongols. I mean, they who are not real Ukrainians. I mean, this just from a strategic perspective, this is not good to alienate millions of your own citizens. And second, he also pointed out that this Arestovich, that it kind of made it made strategic sense now for Russia to use military force to be in Ukraine. Again, he doesn't support it. He wants to defeat the Russians, no, but you have to recognize reality. If you deny reality, you can't have policies which maximize your security. So they put themselves in a position in which Russia is almost become almost impossible now. Imagine if Putin would say tomorrow, well, we'll just let all those eastern regions back into Ukraine, where they would be led by a government who rename streets after Bandera and put up statues after Bandera. Hitler, a fascist who worked with Hitler. It would be impossible for him to do this. It is beyond what he could even do, even if he would want it. So and this was kind of the point of Arestovich as well, and this has also been the concern of Diana Panchenko, that only pushing harder and harder this anti-Russian identity in Ukraine, it's not helping Ukraine. It's cementing its destruction. It's a very dangerous path to go down.
I also did an interview with Richard Sakwa recently, where he said, there's several levels of the conflict that need to be resolved in order for there to be an enduring peace, one of which is internal reconciliation within Ukraine. And what you're saying there really reinforces that. But I guess one of the other levels is the sort of Russia-US relationship. And as we speak, there's sort of mixed signals about what I guess the progress of the peace talks, etc., are. How would you assess the current sort of state of play of moves towards peace or move towards ending the war in Ukraine as initiated by Donald Trump?
Well, first, I would agree with Richard Saka. But I think it's the conflict has three layers. That is, within it has the domestic conflict that is within Ukraine, as we discussed with the Bandera people now running it. I think this is problem. You have deep societal divisions within Ukraine, which aren't easy to bridge. And since 2014, all the balance between these different identities were thrown out the window, and you saw, the ethno-nationalists just asserting themselves in a very brutal fashion. So this is the problem, the domestic issue. And then you have Russia. Second is the Russia-Ukraine. That is obviously doesn't need more explanation, as Russia has invaded Ukraine, and again, Ukraine has very legitimate security concerns about Russia in the future as well. And then the third level is the regional, and that is after the Cold War. Initially, we had agreements for a pan-European inclusive security architecture. This was, written out in the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990. This was the foundation of establishing the OSCE in 1994. However, we walked away from this and we instead pursued NATO expansion. Now, what this did was it redivided the continent and we returned into bloc politics. And essentially the recipe for European stability was simply expand NATO and its military infrastructure closer and closer to Russian borders, while Russia's neighbors had to be, liberated or decoupled from Russia, respect the people want emphasis, because when they pulled the government in Ukraine, the polling showed that if the Ukrainians had to choose, no one wanted to choose. The majority would like to work with both West and East, but if they had to choose, they would have preferred a Russian security arrangement. So again, this was a key problem. So you had domestic, and then you had between Russia and Ukraine, and then you had the regional setting. So I think the good thing about Trump is in Europe we're not allowed to talk about NATO expansion anymore, or in the US we corner ourselves into these narratives because we said this Russian propaganda. So suddenly we can't address the key source behind the war, and NATO expansion is the main source. So he comes into power, and with his big mouth he can say pretty much what he wants, and he says, well, we always knew this would happen if we tried to expand NATO. So suddenly he has given himself so much more room to maneuver. He's allowed to address the European security architecture, because if you can fix the European security architecture, then if you can fix the end the war between Russia and Ukraine, and then you can also begin to address the domestic issues within Ukraine. That is to restore political, cultural, language, religious rights. And but the big picture, the big piece to get in organized is really the European security architecture, because if you don't solve this, you can't end the war either. So I think this is the strength of Trump. And don't get me wrong, the man has plenty weaknesses, but this is, I guess, the main strength he has.
I guess my observational concern would be you can't really negotiate a new European security order without Europe, and at the moment, at least, the peace process in place is more baby steps between Russia and the US rather than a genuine peace building process with all the parties. Do you think there's realistic prospects of a more encompassing sort of peace process at some point in the future?
Well, I think the Europeans have to be brought in. At the moment, both the Americans and the Russians see the Europeans as being very unhelpful, because they continue now 3 years of effectively boycotting diplomacy and negotiations, while just pumping in weapons and trying to prolong this. Indeed, you have some very unsavory statements coming from the Europeans. That is, the British intelligence chief say, "Oh, it's better if we keep the war going for another 5 years so we can arm ourselves." And the Danish prime minister says, "Well, war might be better than peace now." And you hear the same from the Baltic states. It's better that Russia is occupied in Ukraine as opposed to focusing on us. So I think the Europeans have been very unhelpful and disruptive. So for this reason, they've also been excluded from the process. That is, they don't have no seat at the table, and this is a disaster for Europe, because here we are in Europe, and it's being peace here is being negotiated by the Russians and the Americans. But I think the Americans and the Russians have a two-track thing they're doing. The one is they're normalizing relations between each other. That is, they're setting up the diplomatic contacts, the economic contacts, that is, allowing to use each other's payment systems, banks. So normalizing relations between them, so a bilateral thing. And I think this is important, because this is a war between NATO and Russia primarily, and Ukraine is the unfortunate battlefield. And and when we talk about NATO, we really talk about the United States. The Europeans are, playing second fiddle at best. So these are the big pieces you have to solve. If you can fix the American-Russian issue, then other things could fall in place. And I think the Americans and all, they might be able to bring the Europeans on now a bit later, once the Russians and Americans kind of have consensus. But it's going to be a very hard sell, because the Americans seem to agree now, at least Witkoff, to the main demands of the Russians, which is it has to be restoring Ukraine's neutrality, which was the Istanbul Agreement, but then you have Istanbul Plus, that is also the territorial concession. So this 4 regions, and I think that has to be the heart of any agreement. And it's going to be very hard for the Europeans who've been telling their population for 3 years now that they're fighting Hitler. If we don't stop Hitler here, then it's going to take Poland. I mean, all this nonsense. It's very hard to walk all of this back. But I think, the Americans they might be able to apply pressure. I mean, they can do it on the Ukrainians, where, for example, cutting access to the logistics, the intelligence, weapons. They can challenge the legitimacy of Zelensky by calling him a dictator. There's a lot they can do, but with the Europeans, there's less ability to pressure, but there's still things that can be done. And I think when the Europeans see that the alternative is not between Trump's, let's call it a bad deal, and a better deal, but the option is between Trump's bad deal and the complete collapse of Ukraine, and an even worse deal, because the Ukrainians are losing men and territory every day, then, hopefully some rationality would start to kick in, and we would go for the bad deal instead, because my concern now is that if Ukraine collapses and the Europeans continue to say, we're going to send our troops in, they're going to join NATO, what are we really telling the Russians? Well, we're sending a very clear signal that anything you don't take now, the Europeans might enter. In other words, the historical city of Odessa, if this is that British and French troops might be stationed there in the future, we will make these NATO ports to be targeted to be used against Russia. Either you accept this or you conquer Odessa, and then I think the Russians will take Odessa. And I think this is a tragedy for Ukraine, because they would be a landlocked rump state, and I think this is a disaster. So again, this is a problem with narratives, because if you accept that Ukraine is neutral, then the Russians could live with, for example, Odessa within Ukraine. So, but again, with our narratives, this is an anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian thing to say now. So it's very difficult to have any rational discussion.
I would have thought that would also be a tragedy for the European Union, because in the end, Ukraine, not the United States, is the neighbour of the European Union, and if whatever the ultimate outcome of the war, there's going to be economic and social catastrophe there at Europe's doorstep, with some moral responsibility for Europe to fix it, and very little willingness from the United States to help fix it, as opposed to just get its own reparations. So ultimately, I would have thought it would make a lot of sense for Europe to wake up and say, well, maybe we should get on with our neighbours and not fight them.
Well, it's a humanitarian disaster, of course, for the Ukrainians, but it's also strategic, because if they lose all their key territory, their main territories become landlocked, and the country get devastated. Because I also think that the Russians will make a huge mess out of whatever remains of Ukraine to make sure it can't be an effective partner against Russia. Now, this is going to be, beside the humanitarian disasters, means that Ukraine will be a very unstable, economically weak, politically unstable country, which would mean it would be it could be easily interfered from abroad. It would become a very unstable and unsafe neighboring country for both the Russians and the EU. So everyone loses from this. And again, a common sense in politics used to be that deterrence have to be balanced off with reassurance. So if you want security for Ukraine, we only talk about, well, how can we have security guarantees? Do we have British troops in Ukraine? But if you care about their security, you also don't make them a front line against Russia. I mean, if you threaten to put NATO troops in Ukraine, Russia will destroy the country, and this is why they invaded to begin with. And this is not a statement of support; it's just recognizing reality. It would be as if China made put its military bases in Mexico. America will destroy Mexico. They would bomb every city to the ground before they would allow it to become a front line for the Chinese. So this is just reality, and we have to recognize this if we would want to enhance the security. But again, we're stuck in this simplistic thinking. If you stand with them, if you support them, then you have to, promise to send weapons and build bases and missiles. It's just the whole point of international security is point of departure is you recognize the security competition. This is important, but we don't.
You mentioned China, which might be a nice pivot to the broader Eurasian world order, Eurasian collective security arrangements. When Pete Hegseth went to Europe earlier in the year and said, Europe has to pay more for its defence because America wants to, to put a bit of a blunt point on it, to go and fight China, a lot of people in Australia went, that's not really a peace solution, is it? Even if it might be a peace solution for Europe. But and you've talked about European security order, but increasingly Russia and China are talking in the way that you did in your book about collective security arrangements across Eurasia with I think the phrase they use is either less or minimal external power involvement, i.e. less US involvement. And when you think about it, there's a lot of American military involvement across Eurasia, everywhere from Korea to Germany. What are some of the ideas that are emerging around Eurasian world order, Eurasian collective security? Maybe if we just start with the idea of Eurasian world order that you talked about in your book.
Yeah, sure. Let me just first say with Australia, actually, I lived there for 14 years, and I met with John Howard as well, and I heard that him, well, not only just him, but Kevin Rudd that followed him. Everyone said the same thing. We don't have to choose between America and China, but which is, I agree with this. This should be the ambition, but one also have to recognize that there's a lot of pressure which is going to come Australia's way exactly to make that choice. So again, it shouldn't become a Ukraine in Asia in terms of becoming a frontline against the Chinese. Doesn't mean that one has to, submit to China or don't recognize they could have a security challenge to Australia, but just it has to, any deterrent has to be balanced with reassurance. But anyways,
we might come back to Australia in a little bit. Yeah.
Well, with the Eurasian world order, it's it's effectively a response to the unipolar order, which was established after the Cold War, because in the unipolar world order, that is when the United States built its security strategy around the idea that it needed to have global hegemony, that this was the source of security, that no country or group of countries could even have the ambition of coming together and challenge the US. This was seen as a very negative thing, both for Russia, China, as well as others, because in such a system, you don't have to take into consideration the security concern of your adversary. On the contrary, you just have to be so dominant that it doesn't matter what they think. And this is kind of what they had. So, but under this system, it's not just one center of power. You see, the rules of the system is also shifted, because as we see in the UN Charter after World War II, the main idea, what is security? It means mutual constraint. We don't invade, we don't interfere, and then we get reciprocity, thus predictability. We all follow the same rules. Now, you can't have international law based on mutual constraint and sovereign equality if you have a global hegemon, because states do not constrain themselves. Why would the hegemon, the US here, accept constraints on itself? It doesn't make any sense. So what would you expect happen in a unipolar order? Well, you would expect new rules to come in, new norms, ideas, which cements the sovereignty of the US, but reduces it for others. So we then have, humanitarian interventionism, democracy promotion, like all of these ideas, and they all have the same common denominator, which is, because we have human rights and democracy, you can't interfere here, but we can interfere with you. And this has kind of been the main system, which is why this universalism has largely been rejected. So what the Eurasian world order consists of is, like any world order, is the distribution of power and the legitimacy or the rules within that system. So the distribution of power entails multipolarity, which means that all the main countries, China, Russia, they have to not decouple completely, but at least diversify their economic connectivity. That is, they have to trade more with each other, but also establish some technological sovereignty, so have their own tech centers which work with each other, don't be too dependent on American technologies, have their own industries, their own supply chains, their own transportation corridors. So Belt and Road Initiative, these things, your own development banks, trade in your national currencies. it can go into insurance systems to commodity exchanges. So across the board, it's a very big system that has to be built. A lot of this is being facilitated in BRICS, by the way. And the rules of this new order, the Eurasian order, which I called it, was based to a large extent on Westphalia, or actually it harmonizes with the UN Charter, which would be that you have many centers of power, and the great powers have a certain responsibility to take each other's security concerns into interest. I think an evidence of this, which is why many people suspected at least a decade ago that the Russians and Ukrainians would end up in conflict over who gets to dominate Central Asia. This never happened, and the reason is they all recognize that their interest is in a multipolar, greater Eurasia, and then to achieve this, they might have different formats from each other, but they nonetheless, none of them can achieve their goals without cooperating with others. So you see now this need to harmonize relations, which is why Russia's main approach to Central Asia was the Eurasian Economic Union, where it has some institutional privileges in the region. The Chinese have the Belt and Road Initiative, and they ended up trying to harmonize their different initiatives under the auspices of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So you have this, and now BRICS. So you do have an efforts to try to build up a peaceful multipolar system, and I think that that's the direction they're going, but it rejects the universalism. That's very important.
I guess one of the problems with the development of a multipolar and Eurasian world order will be just the American military presence in Eurasia. We talk about the West Pacific. There's all those bases off China. Korea's still divided. There's the Taiwan issue. There's the Japanese bases. There's the increasing military presence in Australia. All the rest of it. How is there a way that you can imagine for there to be, if you like, a peaceful withdrawal of the American military presence from Eurasia? And often the arguments, say, with Don Mearsheimer and co, pivot around this issue of America's not prepared to give up its, it's referred to as primacy in the region, but it's effectively a very significant military presence in Eurasia, not in the United States.
Well, I think the problem, the United States made itself too dependent on military force to maintain this very dominant position, and that's not an accident. I mean, if you want to have a system based on global primacy, it can only be built on alliance systems, because with alliance systems you kind of divide the world into it depends on I guess perpetual tensions. So one side will then be reliant on the United States for security guarantees, and this can be converted into political and economic independence and obedience, and the other side can be contained. So again, this is the reason why in Europe after the Cold War we did have, when we had, like I mentioned before, we had agreements to have a pan-European inclusive security architecture. The problem for the United States would be, what if the Germans and Russians just start trading, they begin to integrate economically, suddenly you have new poles of power forming, which are less reliant on the US, and they form a powerful base. Again, this is what the strategic documents that came out in February of '92, the Wolfowitz doctrine. This doctrine. They show that this is unacceptable. We can't have independent centers of power emerging like this. However, if they expanded NATO, you redivide the continent. Now you're going to have some tensions, of course, between the West and Russia, and based on this, the Europeans will then remain dependent on the United States for security, and Russia can be contained. This is what Zbigniew Brzezinski said. The biggest problem with European integration is that threat is that the Russians and the Germans will get too close. But these are the two main European countries. But again, you have to keep it divided, otherwise the US role disappears. And you see this across the board. This is what happened in the Middle East as well, when the Chinese were pushing for for improving relations between the Saudis and the Iranians. This became a problem. They say, oh well, now who's going to help us contain and weaken Iran is going to be a problem. And also, well, what happens to American influence in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates? If there's no conflict, they're less dependent on security. It's a bit like the Europeans in the 1990s. They began to talk about European Union to have strategic autonomy, European independence, all of these things. This happens when peace breaks out and when there's no security dependence. And this is also why I see often in the United States, whenever there's some tensions brewing between the Chinese and the Indians, there's a little bit of excitement in the media because now the Indians will give up this idea of being non-aligned, and they will have to fall a little bit into the US-led camp. So there's always this incentive to perpetuate conflict, and this is the problem of alliance system. And we have the alliance system because this is a necessity to have global primacy. So I think now, that the Americans are recognizing that the world has become multipolar, as Marco Rubio has said as well. They have to start to prioritize. So which parts of the region or part of the world is a priority? Obviously not Europe anymore. It has been for centuries, but not anymore. So they want to focus on the Western Hemisphere and on Asia. This is their backyard, and also Asia is where things are happening. So Europe suddenly goes from the first priority for centuries and now becoming demoted. Maybe not even second. It could be even third after the Middle East. So it's a huge shift. But anyways, it does mean that when the Americans say, "Oh, we can make peace with the Russians now," because if you pull out of Europe anyways, because it's not interesting, that means now you can make friends with the Russians, and then you prevent the Russians from getting too close to China. So a lot of this makes perfect sense for the United States. But it doesn't mean that Trump is necessarily a man of peace. It just means he's recognizing that the distribution of power has shifted, and he's making new priorities. So now, we don't need the military in Europe. It just pushes Russia towards China. Let's put it in Asia instead and confront the Chinese. So this is not necessarily peace. It just means that the bloc politics will intensify in Asia instead. So what can change? I think, economics. I think the U.S. has overextended itself. I think it's become more aware. This is, this drastic measures by Trump. I don't think they were very good policies. I think they could have done much better. But we have to recognize that the U.S. has, it's reaching the end of the line here. They're pushing soon into $37 trillion. In the hole. It's how they're going to get out of this.
Yeah, and it spends, I think, 40% of the world's military budget is spent by the United States for 4% of the world's population.
Yeah, it's not
secure behind two oceans. It's simply unsustainable. And most of those soldiers are not in the United States, I guess.
But historically, America, much like Britain, they had security strategies based on the policies of an offshore balancer. So that means, you don't need large standing armies like the Russians or Chinese or Germans, who have neighbors, borders, which you have to have as large standing armies during peacetime. You can just build powerful navies and you can keep other countries at bay. Now, but for this reason, how they usually get involved, both the Germans and the British, is whenever there's a big war, just enter the war late, when the other sides have bled out in terms of both blood and weaponry and money, and you come in towards the end of the war, and the main objective is just to make sure that you restore a balance of power, so a dangerous hegemon doesn't appear like the Soviet Union after World War II, and then you pull out as quick as possible, because if you stay there, the other great powers will, instead of balancing each other, will begin to balance you. And this is why it's not a good idea for the US to have such a powerful presence in Eurasia. And they're noticing this now. Look, I mean, what does China, Russia, India, Brazil, what do all these countries have in common? Nothing, but they all only one thing, that is they don't want to see this dominant position of the United States. So now they're collectively balancing the US. If the US can take a step back, they would then begin to more check each other's power. And the U.S. can go back to its home base and then, lick its wounds, recover its economic and strength, deal with all these political and social issues they have. So it's I think the multipolarity is necessary for the U.S. global hegemony now just means they can buy themselves a few more years before they drive off a cliff, because things, quickly going from bad to worse.
And that might be a good place to bring in questions for Australia, I guess, but also probably like many middle powers around the world that are more or less closely allied to the United States, because if America withdraws from Asia, that's both going to strip a lot of the jobs from the think tanks and the defence and intelligence establishment in Australia. They'll have nothing to do, and as well as force a change in diplomatic and defence strategy in Australia as well. And it's what people like Hugh Wyatt and Sam Roggeveen and many others have discussed over time. Now, you worked in Australia.
I worked at the university, at Macquarie University.
Macquarie,
I also did some different teaching, in some of the other Australian Catholic University, New South Wales. I was at the University of Wollongong. Just a bit temp, but I wrote a bit. I wrote a lot actually for Law Institute. So, which is an Australian think tank.
So you'd have a bit of an understanding of the culture, and with the tariff situation, like the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull recently convened a security and sovereignty forum that talked about, dramatic changes in the I guess dependability of the United States, and there was some level of debate about future directions. But I wonder, as an outside observer who knows some of the countries, has met some of the previous leaders of the country, how would you advise an Australian government today to make the most of this sort of new geopolitical environment?
No, I would do exactly what most of the world is doing, because the curse of the unipolar and multipolar world is countries don't have much of an option. That is, in the bipolar world, you either align with one side or the other. So you will be almost subservient to one side and you will be opposed by the other. Now, unipolar order, America was the only game in town. You fall in line. Now, why many countries around the world find multipolarity attractive is because you get to diversify your economic connectivity, avoid excessive dependence on a country which is much more powerful than you. And then this allows you to have more political autonomy and independence. Because, in Europe now, foreign policies, it falls outside democracy. You do what the Americans tell you to. This is, something I guess many in Australia. I remember when I first moved to Australia in 2000, I asked, what are the main foreign policies here? Let's see what the American and British say, and then we drift in that direction, which is fair enough. But anyways, the reason why Turkey, Saudi Arabia, like all countries around the world are diversifying now is this: they can pursue more independent policy. And this is, I think, the ideal thing for Australia too. So I don't think it should, quoting John Howard and Kevin Rudd, I don't think it should choose. It's very dangerous for Australia to choose. I mean, you have excellent relations with the United States. You should keep this. You should maintain good relations with China as well. Doesn't mean you have to be blind to any, challenges, but also recognize that, yes, of course, Australia has the right to have a lot of American troops and bases on its soil, but also, while it has this right, also recognize reality that this could make Australia into frontline against China. But again, it's not a bipolar world, and I think this is something also the rest of the world is trying to prevent. If you look at India, Russia, they're all seeking, they want to have closer ties with China, but they're also diversifying. They're connecting more with each other so they don't form a bipolar world. So you also want to have closer connections with trade with India, which would be, I guess, easier for Australia as well. Japan. I would say Russia as well. Not the great relations at the moment, but also, get more into Latin America, Africa. So just diversify economic connectivity. It's much easier in a multipolar world, and then it's easier not to get sucked into these conflicts because no one can essentially push you around and bully you too much then, because unipolar world, if the United States would threaten to do some economic punishment of Australia, it would have the option: either you fall in line and become a bit subservient, or you lose an important economic role or relevance. in a multipolar world, it's more difficult for the large powers to push around the smaller, medium-sized one, because if a country like the United States says, well, if you don't follow our total line on this, you're not going to have access to these good technologies. The only thing they're doing is handing over huge market shares to its rivals. This is what we're discovering in Europe, by the way. We put all these sanctions on the Russians. We're not going to trade with you unless you fall in line. Well, it's all being replaced by China, India, and other countries in the East. So you're handing over market shares, and that's what happens in a multipolar system. So this is a good thing for small and medium-sized countries, because the negotiation power goes transferred from the most powerful state and goes to the smaller ones and the medium-sized ones. So my goal should be this: avoid alliance systems by all means. No, you don't need any NATO in Asia. It's a curse for Europe. It's destroying our continent. That's why we have war. So look towards ASEAN, for example. This is a good club. And look for inclusive security systems, and one that brings in both China, America. Avoid alliance systems, and at the foundation for this to be sustained, there needs to be, again, diversification of economic connectivity. That is, many partners. Don't get sucked into one alliance system.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think we should learn from India and ASEAN, particularly. To conduct ourselves in a different way in the international system. Interestingly, at that Sovereignty and Security Forum that was chaired by Malcolm Turnbull, the former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, he was the Foreign Minister in the sort of 80s and 90s kind of thing. He outlined sort of 4 principles, 2 of which were less America and more Asia. And increasingly, I think in Australia, people are developing a more all-encompassing concept of Asia, rather than, it's tended to be sort of Northeast Asia, but it's starting to become a more encompassing sense of Asia, all of Asia, including the Russian bits. That might be a bridge too far, but I guess maybe it's an indication of maybe the start of a longer-term debate, like what you said, of moving away from alliance systems towards more multilateral diplomacy.
Well, actually, I was thinking Russia and Australia actually has something in common in Asia, though. That is, both countries would not like to be seen as being remnants of a European colonial era. That is, so the Australians, they often make the point that we have a European history, but Asian geography, and we kind of have to harmonize this. And the Russians say something similar. That is, like Vladivostok and all on the Pacific coast, they can't just be a remnant of a Russian empire who came and Europeans who still live in Asia. That they have to kind of adjust to being more of a Eurasian power. That is, yes, we're European, but we're also Asian. So Dostoevsky's big call, effectively, to be not having to choose. So I think that would be a good approach. And besides, just recognizing the shifting distribution of power. That is, if you have the US as a declining hegemon and China rising, it doesn't mean you switch from one alliance to another one, but just again, the ticket is diversification. Then you avoid these alliances. So I would recommend, by all means, forge as close possible partnership and relationship with the United States. Just make sure doesn't become zero sum. That is, that the relationship with the US becomes a front against China. So that's just for self-preservation. As you know, your former Prime Minister Paul Keating said, you need Asia needs NATO like it needs the plague. This is not what you want. It's not a success story. It was a necessity, NATO, during the Cold War, to have an alliance system, because we have faced with a very powerful Soviet Union, which with either unknown or hostile intentions. So it was in the absence, because we had 2 centers of power, 2 ideologies, in the absence of the possibility of an inclusive security architecture, one based on positive sum game, we went with the alliance systems. But the ambitions after the Cold War was to overcome this and go into a more stable security architecture, inclusive one. We didn't do this because of the lure of global primacy and hegemony. But of course, this is blown up in our face, which is why we're having war in Europe now, and the continent is becoming irrelevant. So this is not what you want to do. You want to skip the whole alliance system and go directly. You have that possibility. So I would definitely go for this.
Yep. And maybe one last question, going back to your home region of Europe. I mean, especially the I guess it's almost like a culture war coming from some US government officials towards Europe. A lot of hostile rhetoric, the trade war, on and off sort of trade war as well. Are there some signs in Europe of people starting to develop a different style of thinking about Europe's positioning in the world vis-a-vis the United States?
Well, again, the problem with Europe is it's not Australia. It's not an entity. It's doesn't have any cohesion with it. Europe is are many countries with very different interests, and it's very hard to align any of this. And when it comes to the United States, the Europeans seem to be stuck in a dilemma. That is, the US, it's the former global hegemon in decline. Some countries want to try to revive the unipolar system, and others want to readjust. So what this means is, if you want to revive the collective hegemony of the political West, they want to increase their value, or their stock value, almost to the Americans, prove their loyalty. So because they know that the Americans are becoming less powerful and we are less of a priority, so they want to make us more attractive. So they want to do this by showing their loyalty. So in this country, for example, in Norway, they're willing to open military bases, follow the United States wherever it goes. More subordination to prove our value to the Americans. And this, of course, results in for example, more hostility towards China. And this is what you see from the EU leaders as well. They're making these belligerent statements towards China, and this is meant to show to the Americans, listen, if you're going to confront the Chinese, you need us, so don't forget about us. So and of course, look at what we're doing against the Russians. We're a powerful continent to be used also against containing the Russians. And so we follow now in Middle East as well. We're prepared to follow the Americans into any disastrous adventure. So this is the one side, and the other one wants to recognize that if the US is declining, the most rational thing to do would be to diversify your economic ties. Don't make yourself excessively dependent on the United States when it has few resources, and then wants to use this resource other places. So what do you do then? Well, we have to get closer, better ties with China, Russia, and the rest of the world. So these are in conflict. So this is why the EU is in such a problem, because on day one they're talking, saying that China is the main enabler for Russia's war in Ukraine, and they're like they're almost evil, and they're security concern for us. And the next day, can you come to Brussels and celebrate 50 years of good, friendly relations? And then, of course, Xi Jinping doesn't want to show up, because we just, you can't do both. And this is the main problem. And I don't think we can get a common position, because two different countries, our countries are too different. And this is the path we're going into, more and more insecurity, economic decline, and geopolitical irrelevance. So I think I don't see any positive things coming out of Europe.
Pretty sad.
No, it is very sad. Again, I live here. I'm a European. This is the continent. Again, I published a book in 2021 called Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia, and I actually wrote about the position we're in now. That at some point, how is Europe going to adjust to multipolarity? Is it going to subordinate itself to the United States in the hope of reviving collective hegemony, or is it going to diversify its economic connectivity and engage more with the rest of the world? And we can't make up our minds, so we're doing both, which means we're doing nothing, and that's the source of our misery, I think.
Well, if it's any consolation, the dynamic you described about the sort of political elites in Europe of sensing the decline of American primacy and then wanting to do everything they possibly can to, be the very, very, very best loyal lieutenant to the United States is exactly the same thing that's happened here in Australia over the last 10 years or so, with this sort of tragic hardening of our position towards China. So
it's not positive for me. Going to Australia was my I want. We're looking at moving back to Australia now that things go so poorly here. So it's not good news for me at all. So, yeah.
But maybe the silver lining is, as I mean, the response to the sort of Trump tariffs around the world, I think, has been a bit of a cultural moment of people saying, well, maybe some of that might break down over time, and that dynamic will become weaker. At least that's what I'm hoping for. Even it might be a long game, but if otherwise, Australia's a pretty great place to live, Glenn. So you shouldn't let that foreign policy task to put you off.
Oh no. Well, there's some similarities, I guess, with Europe and Australia in terms of how they have to readjust. Though unfortunately, it's the right discussions aren't even being held at the time. At least here in Europe, it's all it all goes very simplified. Everything is a discussion between liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, and we have all this kind of conflicting thoughts in our head. Like on one hand, we think, the best way to have stability and peace is to make sure the Americans are locked down here. So let's again fill up our whole country with the military bases, so we can have them sail up in the Arctic, and we'll. But at the same time, Trump is Hitler, and he's a very dangerous, evil man. But also, let's outsource all our security to him. I mean, it's just, and we're so obsessed with personalities. I mean, the pivot to Asia, that was introduced by Obama back in 2000, was 10 or 11. So the Americans are always. This is just the distribution of power. They can't be everywhere. They're going to go where it's most interesting. So they're leaving anyways. But we think, we just stick this out for a few more years, then we'll go back to Obama, which was our, the ideal president for Europe. But it's not happening. It's over. It's the whole unipolar order, as Mark Rubio said, is finished. And Machiavelli, he once wrote 500 years ago that men prefer to see the world as they wish it was rather than the way it actually is, and this is what leads to our destruction. And I think this is a perfect description of Europe at the moment. We made up a fantasy land for ourselves, and we refuse to see it as immoral almost to recognize realities as it is, and we're just continuing to do really stupid things, and no good.
Yep. But at least for now, people are free to speak their minds on channels like this and share their ideas, and hopefully over time that will slowly plant some seeds for a better future, I hope. And Glenn, you've got your own YouTube channel. You appear regularly on many channels. Everyone probably knows, but you also have a Substack where you focus a lot of your writing, etc. So I'll include details of that in the description below. I'm sure people have probably seen it elsewhere as well. But thank you so much for sharing your insights with me today.
Oh, my pleasure. So thanks again for having me, Jeff.